Cool. I'm just going to get started then. So hello there, my name is Ravi. I work for the Information Lab as part of the customer success team. As I mentioned just now, this is the 6th in our series of customer success webinars, which will be focusing on data strategy and a few trends in the lab that have been going on in the last couple of years. We're running, as mentioned, all of our sessions so far, we're running all of our events virtually. So you may have and probably did find this session through Meetup. If you haven't, do join our Meetup page. Last week we ran an entire week on Tableau Prep Builder, all of which are on YouTube or will be on YouTube very shortly. All of the sessions that myself and my colleague Emma have run in the last 3 weeks are also on YouTube as well. So do check us out on there. We've set things out into these nice little playlists, and you'll also find a lot of content around location analytics, for example, as well as tutorials and other sessions that we have run in the past for the last 10 years. So this is, as I mentioned, the 6th in our series. We've gone through things such as building a community of practice in a remote world, data culture in 2020, education and community, data management, governance and monitoring, and we're going to talk about automation and AI today. If you're just joining now, we are using Zoom as our platform today. So feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat window. I will be monitoring this at the end of the session, so I'll be keeping an eye on what's going on there. If you do have any questions throughout, do either use the Q&A or pop them in the chat, and I will catch up with them at the end of this session. So just to level set here, I just want to cover what this session will cover and what it will not. So automation and AI are quite broad terms. So automation and artificial intelligence can relate to a great many things, and I don't pretend to be a data scientist by any stretch of imagination. I'm a business intelligence consultant mainly, and use sort of I'm more of an analyst than a scientist, I'd say. However, so a lot of the topics I'll talk about today will cover some broad brush topics on both topics, as well as digging a bit deeper into data as well. In more focus. So there won't be much about R or Python or TensorFlow or any of those buzzwords. We will be linking these back to data and BI tools. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about understanding automation and AI in 2020 in terms of data. So the International Data Corporation actually did a study last year, which said that global spending on artificial intelligence is projected to top 35 billion in 2019, and more than double to 79.2 billion in 2022. So what's interesting there is this is almost like big data was in the mid 2000s to early 2010s. But everyone was talking about it, but you weren't really sure what it meant and what it actually referred to in the context you're working in. So I've just got some very broad brush definitions on what I see these two terms to mean. The first is automation. So this is the execution of tasks or processes without the need of human interaction. So automation very much covers the fact that we're always looking to find ways that machines can do processes for us in a more efficient way, more effective way, in a faster way, and also that in turn saving us time and money. So that's what I mean by automation. Any task or process that you might see that automates and sort of takes away an additional step that you might otherwise have to take. And AI is a bit more difficult because in the sort of like term AI, you often get machine learning and machine intelligence and other sort of buzzwords pop into there. So what I'm going to really focus on is, while it's linked to machine intelligence learning, it's a computational method to record historical information to support pattern identification. Right. So let's unpick this a bit more, because I think this is perhaps the more broader brush topic of the two. So this is a camera in New York, and it's using something called computer vision, which is an artificial intelligence method. So someone has sat down and trained a model or a software to actually use a camera to spot different things. So for example, all these purple elements being a person, that thing is a car or a truck. In fact, it is a car, and things like traffic lights. So a computer is then able to look at a picture or a moving video and start identifying what's going on. In a more worked example of both AI and automation, I think I always end up going back to sports, which is something that I'm quite interested in. So this is by a company called Second Spectrum. They've got a great TED Talk, which I usually recommend, to talk about how data and artificial intelligence and machine learning are coming into play here. So they started off as this basketball companies, and you can see here this is a mock-up of what the cameras that they use to capture players actually tracks. So they're able to see where the defender is, sort of map them on a grid, and sort of get a good understanding of what's going on. How this actually works is, well, in practice, what they're able to do is use the numbers on players' jerseys to identify who the player is, see them moving around, and sort of understand the tracking. But then also add an additional layer on top of that. So, for example, you can see here, this is a somewhat complex calculation to find shot quality. So these are adding all these different metrics to try and quantify that. So the shot type, whether it's a jumper, there are so many different types of shots in basketball, what the defensive play was, the shot clock, the angle of a jump, the angle of a shot, all of these different things, all taken into account for every single shot. So in basketball, there are over, I don't know, at least over 100 or 200 shots per game. So imagine having to do this calculation on your own without the assistance of computers. So this is what we're able to do. So the artificial intelligence is able to give us the information, the data about what's going on, because it's able to capture that and record that in a better, more accurate and more efficient way, and more consistent way, most importantly, than the human eye can. And secondly, we're then able to automate this calculation, because once this calculation has been done, this model has been deployed, it's able to then repeat that on an infinite scale, because it's a machine and we're able to command it to do that. So I'm going to now pivot to 3 common misconceptions about AI or machine learning or in focus. So the first is this: machine learning and artificial intelligence will eventually replace humans. This is an interesting misconception because it's yes and no. Whilst it may automate a lot of the more manual tasks, similar to the analysts and self-service analytics, I feel like it will augment the work we do. So, for example, I always refer back to the typing pool as a great example of this. So in the 50s and 60s, there were arrays of people typing emails for each other, and letters for each other. However, now we have email, and everyone does their own work. Similarly, so yes, those people have been displaced and replaced by email, a system, a process. But what's actually happened is that workforce is then able to be utilized elsewhere. So you're freeing up resource to be reutilized in a more different way. And humans are then able to, or we are able to, skill in different areas. So machine learning and artificial intelligence won't necessarily replace humans, but they'll augment us, augment the work we do. So for example, if you think about sort of data and analytics, what we're able to do then is actually apply more of the human bias and human sort of cause and effect relationship that a machine might not necessarily be able to understand. So for example, a really good recent example would be that in the last month or two, there might have been a decrease or massive blip or outlier in the data being reported. Now, a machine might not be aware that there is currently a global pandemic going around. So what a human is then be able to do is actually be like, oh, let me identify that, and I can bring additional context to that information, and then potentially even add that as a rule or something to the machine process in the background. The second one is that machine learn from experiences. This is an interesting one because, again, it's a yes and no. Yes, they learn from experiences, but it's very much human directed. So the experiences that a machine will be given or a computer will be given will be driven by data. So the data being the historic information. So this is similar to sort of memory in a human being. So when we remember something bad we did or something that had negative outcomes, we then are able to recall from that information bank to change our behaviors. Similarly, we can train machines to do that. This is where machine learning comes in to play, where we're able to sort of say, this is good, this is bad, and sort of add these rules and outliers and sort of give that experience back to the machine. So yes, so they can learn, but they have to be assisted by humans in order to feed that learning. The third one is that machine learning is the same as artificial intelligence. This is not necessarily correct because Machine learning is very much the ability and the sort of rules and the structure you're setting out and the iterative process where it's sort of listening and understanding. Whereas artificial intelligence is the machine performing a process in an automated way, similar to computer vision, right? So machine learning feeds the computer vision in order to feed the information, right? Rather than being a like-for-like comparison. So it's very easy to be confused or trip over when using these two terms. So let's relate this back to Tableau and Alteryx. So these are two tools that the Information Lab primarily work with. So let's relate this back. So how does automation and AI relate back to these? So the first one is using Tableau Prep Conductor and Alteryx Server. So this is where mainly the automation step. So with automation, Tableau Prep Conductor, it allows you to use Tableau Prep Builder flows to automate that and sort of save time and energy in sort of doing that transformation of data. So a really good example there is folks who are using Prep Conductor or Prep or Alteryx in the case of Alteryx and Alteryx Server to sort of build data pipelines and doing some complex processes. And they don't want to waste someone's time to open up a platform and run every single time. They want that to happen automatically without the need for human interaction. So Prep Conductor and Alteryx Server help those tools to sort of link those two together and then automate that as a process. The second is burst reporting in Tableau Server. So think of this as the report to generate typically for a quarter end for different business units or business regions. So what Tab CMD allows you to do is then burst report these into PDFs or PowerPoints and create those as standalone reports or images. So this allows you, Tableau Server then allows you to either use that as their subscription element to build these out, or just automate the batch production of these documents. This then saves time in creating the fields or changing a field and then downloading each time. You can just create these as a batch process. The third one here is using Alteryx Promote and assisted modeling to deploy statistical models. So this is probably the closest to the data scientist part that we have, because Alteryx Promote and assisted modeling are sort of these two elements which really do relate to data science. So you're using these drag and drop tools because Alteryx allows you to be a citizen data scientist. You're using the drag and drop tools to create a model or a function that allows you to sort of push these statistical processes to the cloud. And then what Alteryx Promote allows you to do is actually deploy that and have that learn and understand and tweak the sort of impact a factor has on the fly. Of course, as mentioned, this does require some level of human interaction, because humans are able to then say, well, actually, we want to weight this higher because of this reason, which perhaps a machine might not be able to do, because of course there are biases in computers that we work with today. So this allows you to not only work and use machines' power, a server's power in terms of Alteryx Promote to actually deploy, but also test millions of models at a time. So it might not just be about creating a model and deploying it, but also to sort of choose the best model and the best fit off different samples of data so that you're able to be more trusting and robust in the analysis and the work you're doing and not fall into statistical traps such as overfitting. The final one here is data-driven alerts, webhooks, and subscriptions. And this relates again to Tableau. So a Tableau platform allows you to add data-driven alerts that automatically alert you, given a certain state in your data, or push them out using webhooks to say, send me something on Slack, send me a text message when this sort of thing occurs. And subscriptions basically push reports into people's inboxes to sort of drive that engagement as well. So all of these are ideas of automation. In a pre-automated world, what would end up happening is, for alerts, you'd have people who are checking in regularly, and spending their time to log into Tableau Server and find out that metric they want to keep a track of, rather than having it being served to them either through a alert or a webhook, or even subscriptions being sent to your inbox. Again, removing that step away from a process. So to round up before we open up for discussions is to talk about the role humans play. And the humans really do play a key role in this. So the first is ensuring trust and governance. So both of these elements are really important because as we move into this world where, if you recall the big data buzzword, this was, again, something that people were almost afraid of to begin with. And what we as practitioners have this ability to do is actually ensure that trust and governance is in place, and also make sure that if something goes wrong or if something is erroneous, we're able to keep a track of it and pick up on it. This is why things like testing and making sure that things are in the right place at the right time, and that the right people have access to changing things in the background as well as the foreground is so important, and making sure that there are processes in place to make sure that there's no misinformation going around. The second point here is humans play a key role in making artificial intelligence explainable. Okay, so this could be through basically breaking things down into simple terms for everyone to understand, but also to make sure that the method that these things are delivered in, so the sort of front end, the visualizations or explainers, or the way that people are interacting with the insights, that's as easy to understand as possible. And it's not just limited to the few, but aimed for the many. This is where artificial intelligence can really become a murky black box thing where people aren't really trustworthy, and being able to explain that out to people and making it as accessible as possible allows to refer to point one, trust and governance to be built. The third one, again, links back to the trust part, which is making sure that you're monitoring automations for error and maintenance. So there may be a time where the clocks change, or there's a change in year and something breaks in your background where the automation stops working. You need to make sure that these are monitored and sort of the automations don't fail on a regular basis, and that they are robust and trustworthy for people to rely on. This means you're monitoring how they're doing, but also monitoring the outputs of any models or anything along that ilk that you're deploying. Alongside this, I think there's also an element of training and understanding for people to say, well, if something looks off, it might not be a problem from the system, but a problem from the user or the way that something is designed. And finally, as sort of subject and domain experts, what we're able to bring as a collective, including everyone watching this, is to champion data and viz literacy in this world. So concepts such as automation and artificial intelligence are fairly difficult and can be quite cumbersome to understand and explain. However, what our role in this world is to make sure that these concepts are accessible as possible, that we're educating people along the way on data, on viz literacy, so that's data visualizations, and making sure that we're playing our part to make sure that we're not being exclusive in this element, but be inclusive so that people are learning and developing and being included in this journey. And of course, finally, to use a quote from iRobot, it's all about asking the right questions. So with automation and artificial intelligence, the insights you find are very much dependent on the questions you're asking, and making sure that you're aware, and everyone who was using and accessing these is aware of the sort of questions that are being put forward. So over to you. So for the last 10 minutes, I thought, given that this is such a broad topic, I'd open this up for discussion. So either raise your hand so I can unmute you if you want to speak, or we're going to use the Q&A function and the chat function to sort of open up and understand where do you see automation and AI impacting or changing the way you guys work. Any questions from the audience? Nothing so far. Cool. So Alex, question from you, which is, do you think natural language programming, NLP, function adds material value or is more of a gimmick? That's a great question. So for those of you that don't know, natural language processing is basically a way of understanding if a human types in something, changing that query into machine terms so that it sort of gives you back a query. So Tableau's answer to this is something called Ask Data. I think it does have has a really interesting use case here, because in BI, it's about understanding who the features are designed for and who's actually accessing that information. So what something like NLP allows you to do is lower that barrier to entry even further. So while someone might use something like Tableau or Alteryx to have some easy self-service automated business intelligence, what NLP allows you to do is say, well, maybe if you're intimidated by the interface used by, say, for example, Tableau or by Alteryx, it doesn't really compute, or you just want to find an answer really quickly from a data source. What I think NLP adds is allows people to sort of access it at their level. So one of the key things I always discussed with customers when our study did come out is not necessarily for the analysts, but more for either executives or folks that haven't really used any business intelligence tools before and would like to understand what's going on with data. So I feel like that's what the NLP can bring. Yes, it is somewhat gimmicky, and it can be, I can understand that sort of viewpoint, but what I think it adds is an additional rung, an additional access point for people to sort of start interacting with business intelligence in a robust way. But yeah, thank you for that question, Alex. Hopefully that answers it. David has asked a question, which is clarify again the difference between machine learning and AI. Sure. So this is, again, my interpretation and the sort of how I've seen it interact in these terms. So what I see as machine learning is something where you're educating a machine and training a model or training something to learn something and then also continue to learn that thing, right? Whereas artificial intelligence is using stuff like natural language processing, where you've almost set these rules and it's automating that process, if that makes sense, and sort of picking up either existing models or existing statistical processes. And it's a bit more, it's not as iterative. So I think the main difference I see is machine learning is more of that iterative process that feeds AI, whereas AI is more of it's got the intelligence and it can understand the differences between what it's looking at and then take an action based off that. That's, again, my understanding of it and sort of how I see it applied to the world of BI. Of course, as I said, these are two very broad topics and can be interpreted in different ways for different parts of the industry. Cool. So Stephen has a question, which is, I've seen functionality enabling interactions with Tableau from WhatsApp to answer questions along the line of Ask Data. That could be a use case. Is it come direct into Tableau? Yeah, that's a really good use case. So I think these are like chatbots. I think I was recently speaking to a colleague about the prevalence of chatbots and the way that almost the current period we're in has made us think about how we use sort of call centers versus these chatbots or things like that allow us to get a bit more information or something back from these canned responses. So I agree. I think that extending these into like WhatsApp, or say, for example, getting a text message when your server's down or when you hit, I don't know, 100 views on that workbook you've worked on for so long. These sort of things are great ways of extending beyond just the Tableau platform. I'm not sure if this is going to come directly from Tableau, but with webhooks, you're definitely able to do that. So my colleague Andre de Vries has written and is working very closely with understanding how webhooks can be deployed at scale. But I think that's where the benefits will definitely come from. Taking that sort of data-driven insight, automating it, and having those back-end recommendations and discovery processes happening, and then pushing them out to things like WhatsApp, things like Slack, Teams, etc. I think what's also interesting there, hopefully that answers your question, Stephen. I think what's also interesting there is understanding that all of these companies, the devices we use, there's always some level of natural language processing or artificial intelligence working anyway. So for example, the iPhone, they created this app called Shortcuts, which you can set as a process to run automated processes. Now, a lot of what was fed into that is based off your own interaction. So for example, if I text my family regularly at a certain time, what will happen is Siri Shortcuts is then understanding what I'm doing at different times. And if it becomes a habit, it's then prompting me saying, hey, do you want to do this? For example, or, if I'm setting an alarm every night for 6 a.m., around 9:30, it might prompt me and say, hey, you usually set an alarm this time. Do you want to do that now automatically so you don't have to open the app? It's that sort of thing that I think is augmenting the experience we have as consumers, not just in the data sphere, but in our everyday lives. And similarly, you can start adding these on to different processes and things like that. So as I mentioned, automation and AI very much depends on the questions you're trying to answer and then trying to find the correct solution that sort of links both the machine side as well as the human interaction. Cool, a question from Nicole. Our organization is currently in the process of transforming into a data-driven operation. Excellent. So we've upgraded our IT systems, network, etc. Our unified systems don't have a dashboard. We just use Tableau Desktop to process a data set from our system in order to get insight and turn data into information that can be used by operation leads. Do I have any recommendations or suggestions in order to become operation adopt the automation and make existing AI enabled? Great question. Yeah. So I think all of these have to be fair. Like, so Tableau Desktop, the sweet spot it sits in is where you're able to access data in a regular basis. So what I'd say for operational sides of things, the first step would be to make sure that there's an automated process that's pushing operational data back into your operational data into your sort of front end business intelligence tool. So in this case, Tableau Desktop. So what you then want to be able to do is monitor that and deploy that on something like Tableau Server, so that it's monitored and it's accessible to the right people at the right time. So what you're then able to do is then set up data-driven alerts to say, hey, when this drops below this mark or above this mark, or this happens on a frequent basis, send me an alert by email, or again, using webhooks, you can extend that further. So the other things you can then start doing is start being a bit more smart about how your platforms are being accessed, when you're up times and down times. How can you start maintaining? So I think the first step is with sort of data-driven AI and data-driven automation is to get everything in one place, or in a state that you're able to analyze and sort of get insight from, and then sort of move forward into taking that to a reporting stage, which is what you're talking about here. And then on top of that, you can then start automating. But I think what's really important when you do these steps is to make sure you're defining what is success early on. So when you're deploying and changing and doing these data-driven transformation processes, making sure you've got your key success indicators set up really means that you're not sort of scrambling afterwards to show the value, but you're tracking that value through the process. So that could be time to insight, that could be man hours saved, that could be or automation of processes, and sort of transferring that to cost and sort of cost saved and insights that can then save money. I think that was a bit of a broad answer that sort of fragmented in different areas, but hopefully that answered your question, Nicole. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. Are there any other questions or follow-up or any things like that that people would like to ask? Okay, cool. So just to finish off, as I mentioned, we do have the final session of this series coming up on Thursday. Myself and my colleague Emma White will be talking about agility with data. So do be sure to join us there. But until then, I'm going to leave it open for a couple of minutes if there's any more questions. But everyone take care and hopefully speak to you on Thursday. Cool. Just leave this open for until 3 o'clock. If anyone has any final questions they want to ask. Okay, cool. I'm just going to wrap it up there. Thank you again for attending this session. Like I said, there is one final session. There is one final session on Thursday. Final question from Alex. What is the most useful ML implementation you've seen in a BI and analytics context? That's a good question. I think we've got one customer who's worked with trying to sort of understand bringing in some Salesforce interaction. So in terms of marketing, I think that's a really interesting use case where you're able to sort of understand user methods and then start predicting from there. I think when you start using models to then deploy in our finance customers, we've got one customer that's very much focused on using a specialized tool called Data Robot in terms of pushing and deploying models further. I think that worked really nicely, especially when you could sort of show that really high value return on investment. But yeah, I think it really depends. I think a lot of customers are doing some sort of AI and machine learning process because you're using previous data to inform future solutions. So machine learning doesn't necessarily mean some high-level tool that's available to do this. It could just simply be based on an automatic process. So I think in finance, for sure, I think that's a really good implementation using a bunch of models to start detecting fraud. I can only imagine that betting companies are doing more. And then finally, as I mentioned before, like there's a couple of others using just simple Alteryx to sort of use that previous information to go forward. And one final question from Nicole. What are the two differences of Microsoft? What are the differences of the two Microsoft Viz tools such as Power BI and Tableau? Yeah, this is a great question. I think we're in the process of planning a session that can help answer this. So doing a comparison between Power BI and Tableau. I think for me, Power BI's benefits come from its familiarity and its ability to connect directly to sort of into the Microsoft Azure stack, and the fact that a lot of extensibility comes from Azure. However, I think also see that as a weakness, that you do rely a lot on Azure for that extensibility. For Tableau, I see it as the best in class, of course, because it's easy to understand, there's a low barrier to entry, and it almost forces you to do good visualization best practices. I think the other limitations of Power BI are around the engine that drives it, and a couple of sort of quick exploration. So the two key things I always talk about when talking about Power BI is, well, Power BI has a limitation in the way it's driven in the engine, because it has a limitation on the number of marks it can show. And then the second one is that Power BI is very much like, it's like a Porsche without wheels. You can make something look really good, but you can't really drive your analysis anywhere else. Because what Power BI is really good at is creating a dashboard, but what's not so good at is being that tool for exploration. So I think the big difference between the two is the exploration piece. But like I said, Power BI does have some benefits, but I think Tableau still remains best in class in terms of a whole platform and sort of that delivery to insight, in my opinion, of course. But yeah, keep an eye out. And I think if you want to comment on our meetup page, that'll get see if there's any other people who are interested in a Power BI versus Tableau session. But thank you, that was a really good question. Cool. With that, I'm going to close the session. Thank you again. Do be sure to check out the other sessions and training we have running on our meetup page, and then any other sessions that we've run on YouTube. Thank you, and everyone take care. Speak to you on Thursday. Cheers, everyone.